Throughout the years, the Final Fantasy series has seen millions of players battling across myriads of different dungeons. And being a staple of the role-playing genre, these dungeons have come in countless forms, not to mention some dramatic levels of difficulty. While most of these dungeons have been on the beaten path, tailored towards the player's typical level and knowledge of the game at that point, other dungeons were optional, designed to provide a level of challenge that went way beyond the main quest. And while venturing inside could reap some tantalizing rewards, such as rare equipment, treasure, trophies, and bragging rights, some of these dungeons were infamously hard and frustrating, leaving us cursing the fact that we ever found them to begin with. We've talked about difficult dungeons before in a previous video some years ago, but there were just so many other memorable ones throughout the series that we decided to delve back in and talk about some others. Plus, you'll find a few mentions to some earlier Final Fantasy titles on this list, because those are worthy of inclusion too, as many of you rightly told us on the previous video. So, in our typical granular style, here are 7 more of the hardest optional dungeons that made you regret ever entering. Our first entry comes from Final Fantasy Tactics, and it goes by Midlight Deep or Deep Dungeon depending on the version you're playing. As its name suggests, this dungeon was deep, dank, and highly dangerous, hosting 10 levels of fiendish foes shrouded in darkness and with the additional joy of having constantly shifting exits. And it also potentially served as a loose allusion back to an earlier franchise. After defeating Ramza's undead brother, Zalbag, and then triggering a conversation in the Wailu's trade city, a path opened up to an island in the east. After travelling there, the party could then begin working through the dungeon in the hope of gaining some rare items and skills. Besides the minor issue of lighting the battlefield, just so you could even see what you were doing down there, the enemies faced were often several levels above your own. Once an enemy was defeated, they'd become a crystal that provided at least some kind of illumination. But characters could also use the teleport ability to highlight all the places they could move to. But then there was the matter of finding the exit before defeating the last enemy, because if you did knock out the last enemy standing and hadn't found the exit yet, your party was kicked out of the dungeon and you'd have to start the level all over again. While Midlight Deep contains some of the best treasure around, you'd have to snatch it up quickly, as enemy treasure hunters could also find it first. But characters also needed to have the Move Find item ability equipped, and to keep their bravery stat low in order to obtain the best possible items from treasure panels, as this was a major factor in determining the reward. At its deepest level, Midlight Deep culminated in a battle against the super boss Elidibus, considered to be the strongest enemy in the game. He was flanked by several allies, but the party was accompanied by a special guest of their own named Byblos, who could even be recruited after the battle if he survived. Elidibus had many frustrating attacks, including the highly infuriating Poison Fog, but he could also call forth the powerful Zodiac summon, and this served as the only opportunity for one of your own summoners to learn it. Many different strategies, party structures, and loadouts have been recommended by Tactics fans for tackling Midlight Deep, along with a variety of creative ways to handle the final boss. However, for those who wanted to learn Zodiac, accomplishing this was challenging indeed, as they'd need to keep Elidibus and their own summoners alive until the spell could be learned. Sticking within the world of Ivalice, our next entry comes from Final Fantasy XII. We talked about the Great Crystal in our previous video, which was a nightmare to navigate even with a guide. But we thought the Subterra of the Pharos also merited a place on our list. The lower levels of Pharos, known as the Subterra, could be accessed after finishing the main Pharos events and destroying the Suncrest. Again, this was a dark dungeon to explore, and players needed to collect black orbs and place the exact number required on the 4 pedestals of night to light up each level and grant access to new ones. In total, there were 4: Penumbra, Umbra, Abyssal, and Hell's Challenge. And while fan-created maps of the Subterra can be found online, no maps were obtainable within the game itself. Plus, the minimap in the corner was disabled, making this dungeon crawl all the more complicated. During their descent, players also had to be wary of magic pots, a recurring enemy of the franchise that could deal some pretty serious damage in this particular edition. For this reason, it was always recommended to keep a few elixirs on hand to appease the pots so you could carry on the quest unharmed. Now, one of the main reasons for exploring the Subterra was to track down the marks for 2 elite hunts, Ixion and the Shadowseer. Ixion could spawn on any of the levels, but in order to take on the Shadowseer, you'd first need to access the deepest unknown area by clearing the other levels and finding and defeating Phoenix, which could appear anywhere in the Subterra. Upon reaching Hell's Challenge, the party was immediately launched into a battle against the Shadowseer. Once its health dropped to 80%, the Shadowseer began summoning other marks to assist, making the fight last longer and forcing your team to constantly switch up tactics. After his servants had been dispatched, the Shadowseer could then finally be vanquished, and the player was able to return to the service and seek out their rewards. Not to be confused with the reality TV show of the same name, Dragon's Den from Final Fantasy VI was full of, you've guessed it, dragons. However, these weren't the only challenges lurking within this particular dungeon, which was first introduced in the Game Boy Advance version. Much like in Kefka's Tower, Dragon's Den required the player to split their party into groups of 4, so balancing teams was key to success. In order to unlock this dungeon though, you'd first need to defeat the 8 dragons found throughout the World of Ruin and earn yourself the Crusader Magicite. By the time you faced them in the den though, the dragons had grown stronger and learnt a few more tricks, but they were still small fry compared to what awaited players at the end, the Kaiser Dragon. With a huge amount of HP, along with the ability to revive itself multiple times, the Kaiser Dragon was a force to be reckoned with. It could shift its elemental magic with barrier change, inflict status ailments with Mind Blast, or use Heartless Angel to reduce your party's HP down to 1. Not only that, but upon defeat, the Kaiser Dragon unleashed Ultima. Defeating the dragon, or surviving, granted the Diablos Magicite, and unlocked a second secret superboss found in the same layer should you choose to re-enter. Trawl through the dragon's dungeon a second time, and you'd be faced by a mega weapon. As well as sharing some attacks with the Kaiser Dragon, a mega weapon also wielded several abilities that could wipe the party out in one fell swoop. Plus, it could regenerate itself twice after being defeated. For this reason, completing the Dragon's Den was something definitely for completionists, as the reward was Murakamo, and it's debatable how useful that was at this late stage in the game. Still, how players were supposed to find out about a mega weapon in the first place, especially without an online source or strategy guide, is anyone's guess. Costlemark Tower from Final Fantasy XV was only accessible at night, and it was easily one of the toughest dungeons in the game. According to the in-game lore, this tower was once part of the ancient civilization of Solheim. An expedition into the ruins was once led by a former king of Lucis, but after an encounter with a ferocious demon, none survived, and legend has it that the king even sacrificed himself in order to seal the beast within. So, of course, that's where you come in as the player. Costlemark Tower featured 60 floors plagued with high-level enemies, most of which were demons. For this reason, it was recommended that your party was at least level 50, and that you brought a ton of healing items, while also having the ability to cure or prevent petrify. One particularly frustrating part involved interacting with a series of cubes and solving puzzles by moving walls. You'd also have to fight against an increasingly difficult series of bosses after each puzzle, the third of which pitted you against 3 red giants and a Naga all at once. In between puzzle solving, you'd also have to be careful not to touch the red platform that could teleport you back to the entrance. Finally, the ferocious Jabberwock appeared. Upon defeat, it dropped the Sword of the Tall, and as well as getting a pretty sick-looking sword, this also unlocked the secret achievement or trophy, Faithful Heir, awarded for obtaining all 13 of the Royal Arms. Finishing the dungeon was also a requirement to obtain the Dungeon Seal key that opened the secret locked doors in all the game's other dungeons. However, the Jabberwock would not go down easily, and many of its attacks inflicted the stone status, which is why plenty of petrification cures were necessary. To make matters worse though, Costlemark Tower was also home to numerous bugs and glitches, including the camera locking after using Warp Strike and defeating the boss not triggering the end of the quest. If that happened, you'd have to exit the dungeon and wait until nightfall so that you could fight the Jabberwock once again. The Crystal Tower from Final Fantasy III served as the base for the wizard Xande, and was the area where the imbalance between light and dark was the strongest. The Crystal Tower also concealed the entrance to the Forbidden Land of Eureka, a long, sprawling dungeon with plenty of boss encounters and some of the best gear available in the game. And as it was situated right near the trigger for the end game, this meant exploring Eureka was a valuable excursion to take before embarking on your final mission. Provided that you'd already got the Eureka key from Doga and Unai, the journey through the Forbidden Land was littered with hidden paths, dead ends, and multiple floors full of random encounters. But it was all worth it to get your hands on some great treasure, all guarded by individual bosses, which included the Ribbon, Masamune, Excalibur, and the Elder Staff. Completing the dungeon in certain versions of the game also unlocked the final 2 job classes, Ninja and Sage. But if you thought Eureka was a long, hard slog that probably could have done with a save point or 2, then you'd need to brace yourself for the final dungeon crawl through the Crystal Tower and the World of Darkness. The name, the Forbidden Land Eureka, was then reused for a location in Final Fantasy XIV, which brings us onto our next entry. The Palace of the Dead was added to the Heavensward expansion and was the first deep dungeon added to Final Fantasy XIV. Initially it spanned 50 floors, but this was stretched to a staggering 200 with subsequent patches. But what's truly memorable about this dungeon was its shape-shifting, roguelike nature, plus the palace played with some pretty unique rules. Accessible after completing the quest The House That Death Built in New Gridania, players could register to take on the dungeon solo or as a group. Once inside, all characters were made to start at level 1 and needed to battle enemies in order to gain enough experience to continue. What's more, players were restricted to only using a specific weapon and piece of armor, which could then be enhanced by obtaining silver coffers. The armor then took on the appearance of the character's current gear and thankfully wasn't subjected to loss of durability. Floors were generated at random, and players could gain access to different areas using the Cairn of Passage stones, which could only be activated after all of the enemies on the current floor had been defeated. Boss encounters took place on every 10th floor, and provided they were defeated, players could then record their progress and choose to leave and return later. As players progressed, it became all too easy to accidentally aggro enemies, activate traps, or spawn mimics. But for seasoned dungeon crawlers, a little bit of chaos is all part of the fun. Now, for our final entry, we're going to look at a bonus dungeon made for the PSP Anniversary Edition of the very first Final Fantasy game. The Labyrinth of Time contained 30 puzzle-filled floors which were randomly generated, and each one challenged the player's logic, problem-solving skills, or memory. After clearing 10 levels, the player would then come face to face with one of 8 versions of the dungeon's superboss, Chronodia. This dungeon was definitely a commitment. Once inside, you couldn't cast exit or teleport, nor could you save your game at any point. And to make things even more intense, dying in the labyrinth resulted in a game over, which was different to the Soul of Chaos dungeons where you'd be transported outside. In other words, if you didn't go in prepared, then you probably weren't making it out alive. Another factor which feels appropriate for a time-themed dungeon is that each challenge came with a time limit. Failing to meet the time limit forced the player to break the red seal, and this then cost HP and MP for every extra second on the clock. However, you did have the option to sacrifice your abilities and commands in exchange for some precious extra seconds, so players needed to choose wisely how they wanted to proceed. That then brings us to Chronodia, the dungeon's boss and hardest enemy in the whole game. Depending on how many red seals you'd broken, Chronodia could be flanked by up to 4 fiends during the battle, as well as chaos and miscellaneous weapons. However, there was still value in fighting these stronger forms and making repeat visits to the Labyrinth of Time, because each version of Chronodia came with its own entry in the bestiary as well as its own unique item drop, which consisted of one of 8 pieces of the highest level armor or weaponry. But if you found yourself tearing your hair out after just the 4th or 5th showdown with this superboss, then we can't say we blame you for calling it quits at that point. But with that, they were 7 of the hardest dungeons that you may have regretted entering. Be sure to let us know in the comments below though which of these dungeons you finished, and if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent and Sukun TDK or Super Special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.